Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being here. Mr. Gray, I want to come to you. Many of us have seen what China has done in Africa, around Djibouti, with the port that is there, and also in Latin America. And we have listened to Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership talk about the Polar Silk Road and putting this as a part of their Belt and Road initiative. So I'd like for you to talk about why it is important that we strengthen this bond with Greenland and pay more attention to this because of the impact of the CCP.
Senator, it's a great question. This is a playbook that the Chinese Communist Party run. They do it all over the world. I've seen it personally in the South Pacific. They do it in Latin America. They do it in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. They start by, you could call it the Belt and Road Initiative, you can call it the Polar Silk Road, whatever terminology they want to use. But what it is predatory lending, primarily usurious interest rates for what we often call white elephant projects, projects that very often serve no economic purpose.
And don't last. And then they're stuck with debt diplomacy.
Exactly. And once they have the debt diplomacy, ma'am, the Chinese come in and use that as for coercive political control over small developing states that can't push back and don't have the ability to counter the CCP's malign influence. And what I'm so concerned about and why I think this topic is so critical is that something very similar we're beginning to see bits and pieces of this in the high north, in the Faroe Islands, in Greenland to some extent in recent years. We've seen it in Svalbard. We've seen it in Iceland. This is beginning to happen. The Chinese are signaling their intention to pursue this more actively, and that's why because we know the playbook, we need to be prepared to push back proactively.
Dr. Pincus, I want to come to you because I had seen a quote from Biden NSC Council Director Brennan, and he made a comment at a Wilson Center event in 22 that the U.S. has accepted that China has a, and I'm quoting him, vested interest in the Arctic. I completely disagree with that because China, just because they're calling themselves a near Arctic neighbor, does not give them a vested interest. And I want you to talk a little bit about that type attitude with that perspective that China is using this for their security and endangering our national security.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. China has expressed its interests in the Arctic with an Arctic policy statement that came out in 2018, and they mention a host of interests that they have in the region. They talk about the emergent shipping lanes, they talk about natural resources, they talk about scientific data, and so those are their articulated interests in the region. And I think it's, in terms of their economic interests, China is a resource importing country. There's a lot of resources in the Arctic region. It is not surprising that they would pursue those resources. Their pursuit of those resources is adverse to the interests of the United States.
Okay, Mr. Gray, I want to pivot to you on this because China focuses on dual-use technologies. And of course, we don't know where the China Economic Development Department, MOFCOM, ends, pardon me, and their military begins. And this is what they couch as dual use. And I would like for you to give what you see as specific steps that we can take against the CCP in this regard to stop them from using this as a research and test site.
It's an incredibly important question, Senator. I think this is where my concerns about the current trajectory of the political relationship between Denmark and Greenland are so acute. We have to have a plan for this, the reason you outline, and for reasons of even more conventional military purposes. We have to have a plan for what comes next. And if we don't know what the 56,000 people in Nuuk, what their political organization looks like post-Copenhagen, which they say will happen, what you're describing is going to become even more prevalent. And we've seen this happen in places in the South Pacific that are similarly sized. We have to have a plan for what comes next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.